Sarika had studied predators all her life. She knew the cycle of life on her world, and she knew the rules that held the food chain together. The great beasts that roamed the Scarlet Plains were known as Draxors, and they were the apex predators. Of the planet Zarin, they towered over every creature with muscle-bound frames covered in black-scaled hide and jaws, powerful enough to crush armored vehicles. No species, native or foreign, had ever dared face a Draxor head on entire hunting clans, avoided their territories, and the council declared their valleys forbidden zones. Sarika had lost colleagues to these monsters, their broken bodies carried back only for proper mourning. So when she came across the human that day, she expected another corpse to study. Another example of arrogance crushed under primal law. Yet what she saw made her clutch her recording lens in disbelief. For the human was not fleeing, and he was not hiding. Instead, he was crouched on a ridge, blood smeared across, his face and arms tearing into the carcass of a dead Draxor with bare hands. His teeth ripped flesh from its still warm body, as though it were nothing more than livestock cooked for a feast. Sarika blinked her 4 eyes again and again, thinking. Her senses had failed her. The human's name was Elias Ward. She remembered it from the manifest of exploration crews of fragile species sent from a death world called Earth. And though she had never understood the classification of death world before, this moment she felt a shiver pass down her back. The human looked up mid-bite, his eyes catching hers across the clearing. He did not startle. He did not flinch. His gaze was calm, almost amused, and he simply raised a strip of dripping flesh before, sinking his teeth in again. Sarika backed away, her translator band recording every word she whispered. Impossible. No one consumes a Draxor, not even scavengers. They leave the carcass untouched, for the hide carries toxins, and the meat carries parasites. Even the strongest soldiers die if they try. Yet this human ate as though born for it. She steadied her breathing and watched him. His movements were efficient, his body lean but strong. His every motion told her that this was not madness. It was hunger, controlled and direct. Elias Ward finished his grisly meal with deliberate slowness, and when he rose to his full height, he stood no taller than her shoulder. Yet there was something in his stance that made him feel larger. He walked toward the beast's severed head, gripped its massive jaw, and forced it open with a strength no human skeleton should allow. He studied its fangs, then snapped one free as casually as snapping a twig, tucking it into his belt as a trophy. Sarika knew she had to report. This the council would laugh. They always laughed at human myths and their talk of wolves and lions from their homeworld. But no laughter would come when they saw what she had seen. She turned and hurried back across the ridge, her recording lens heavy with evidence, each step echoing in her mind. The human is feeding on the apex predator. Her thoughts repeated it again and again. The human is feeding on the apex predator. And as she fled, she could still feel his eyes on her, calm, steady watching, as though he knew the terror he had planted within her, and as though he welcomed it. The truth she carried would shake her people. She knew it would ripple through the council halls. It would travel the stars, and no one would ever look at humanity the same way again. Sarika walked through the grand marble halls of the planetary council chamber, her hands trembling as she held the recording lens close to her, chest the tall glass arches above her threw pale light onto the council floor, where dozens of alien leaders sat in a wide circle, each cloaked in the colors of their species. Authority banners. She felt the weight of their gazes pressing down on her as she stepped into the center pit. Her voice cracked when she announced she had evidence that a human had broken the sacred order of Zarin by feasting on the flesh of a living god, a Draxor. The gathered voices rose in murmurs, some scoffed, others leaned forward in curiosity. The High Chancellor, a broad-scaled being with silver frills named Vorus, raised his claw for silence and demanded she present the evidence. Sarika activated the lens. The image flickered into the air, showing Elias, crouched over the predator's corpse, his teeth tearing into its black flesh. The sounds of ripping muscle and crunching bone echoed through the chamber. A shiver passed across the audience, a ripple of disbelief mixed with unease. Sarika explained, in a hurried voice, that the Draxor meat carried toxins no known species survived its touch, yet the human consumed it without hesitation. She told them how he stood calm and unshaken, how he broke the beast's fang and claimed it as a trophy. Silence followed her words until finally the chamber erupted. Some delegates laughed cruelly, dismissing it as a staged deception. They called her a dreamer, a scientist driven to madness by field stress. Others hissed that it was impossible, that humans were fragile weaklings from a backwater planet meant to serve as laborers, not warriors. One elder shook his long tendrils and said the footage must be altered. Voris raised his claw again and spoke with calm, measured tones, saying the council would review the evidence, but until then Sarika should remain silent, for the stability of their society depended on order. He claimed the masses would panic if such wild claims spread. Sarika felt heat rising in her throat. Her 4 eyes burned with frustration. She demanded they take the human into custody to test his blood, to examine his resilience, but the chamber drowned her out with laughter echoing across the dome. Only a few sat quiet. Their eyes narrowed in thought. She noticed them. She noticed how fear glimmered behind their mockery. They feared it was true, and they feared what it might mean. Word traveled quickly. Despite the order to silence her, whispers spread among citizens in the lower market, stories of a human who ate the gods of Zarin rolled off tongues in secret corners. Children repeated it in awe. Soldiers muttered about it in barracks. Merchants told travelers, until the rumor grew into legend. Sarika walked the streets and saw fear in the faces of her people. Some mocked her as she passed, yet others pulled her aside and asked in hushed voices if it was true, if humans could truly eat the untouchable. She told them yes, and each time she spoke the word truth, she felt the weight of what she had seen pressing deeper inside her. The council summoned her again days later, Voris's frills twitching with annoyance as he told her to cease her claims or risk exile. Sarika bowed, but her heart burned. She knew the galaxy would soon see what she had seen, for no rumor this sharp could be buried. She returned to her quarters, staring out across the night plains of Geron, where the Draxors roared their dominance to the stars. Yet she no longer felt fear when she heard them. She thought instead of the small, fragile-shaped human who had crouched above a dead monster and chewed calmly as though the order of nature meant nothing. And she realized the truth had already begun to change her people, and soon it would change the galaxy. The council could not contain the whispers. For long and soon an order was passed to capture the human who had unsettled the balance of their world. Elias Ward was found on the far edge of the Scarlet Plains, walking calmly with the broken fang of the Draxor still hanging from his belt. The patrol units approached him with weapons raised, expecting resistance or fear, but the man simply stood with his hands behind his back and waited, his expression unreadable. When they bound his wrists and dragged him toward the council city, he did not speak. Sarika stood behind the glass wall of the council chamber as Elias was brought before the gathered leaders. His shoulders were relaxed, his steps steady, as though the trial meant nothing to him. Voris leaned forward with silver frills spread wide and demanded the human explain his actions and whether the recording was a fraud. Elias lifted his head and spoke in a calm, steady tone, saying, "It was no fraud. He had killed the beast and eaten it because he was hungry." His words rang through the chamber like the strike of metal. Sarika saw the outrage spark among the counselors. They called it blasphemy. They called it insanity. Yet Elias did not raise his voice. He began to tell them stories of earth, of wolves with teeth like knives and lions with roars that shook the night, of crocodiles that lurked in rivers, and of bears that weighed as much as machines. He told them that his kind had hunted such creatures not with natural weapons but with cunning, with fire, with traps, and with endurance. He spoke of running his prey until exhaustion broke them, of standing his ground against jaws and claws, and of how his people had survived because they learned to look into the eyes of monsters and refused to run the chamber. Grew still as his words carried across the air. Sarika felt her breath catch as he explained that eating the flesh of a predator was nothing new to humans, that they had done it for thousands of years, that their bodies had grown strong because of it, and that fear had been beaten out of them by firelight and survival. Voris slammed his claw against the stone rail and accused him of lies. He shouted that no fragile species could stand against a Draxor, that the toxins alone would kill him. Elias only smiled faintly and replied that poison was not new to humans either. He spoke of plants that could kill with a single bite of insects, that injected venom into flesh of snakes that carried death in their fangs. And yet his people lived alongside them and learned to endure. Sarika felt the chamber shift. The laughter was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. Some counselors whispered behind their sleeves, others tapped their claws nervously. One or two leaned closer, their eyes bright with fascination. Elias said that the galaxy had made a mistake in thinking humans were weak. He said they were not the tallest or the fastest or the strongest, but they were the most relentless, and when a predator challenged them, they did not bow. They learned to hunt it and make it their meal. Sarika trembled as she listened, her heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and admiration. She could see it in the eyes of others too. The realization that the stories may be true, that the human was not boasting but simply stating fact. Voris finally dismissed him and ordered he be held in confinement until further review. But Sarika knew it was too late. The words had already spread beyond the chamber, carried on every whisper and every frightened gaze. She walked away knowing the galaxy had been given its first true glimpse of what humanity really was, and nothing would ever erase it. The days following the trial brought tension across Jaren, for while the council tried to bury the whispers, the predators of the plains reminded everyone of their reality. When a trade convoy passed through the low valley, it was torn apart by a single Draxor. The guards fired their plasma rifles, the merchants screamed and scattered. But the beast moved like a storm, crushing vehicles with its weight and tearing apart soldiers as though they were made of paper. News spread fast, and soon the council chambers were filled with panic. The citizens demanded safety. The merchants threatened rebellion, and the soldiers spoke of abandoning the frontier. Voris tried to calm them with promises of increased patrols and stronger weapons, but everyone remembered the human who had faced one alone and lived. Sarika stood in the corner of the chamber when Elias was brought forward again, chains still around his wrists, though his eyes remained calm as always. Voris sneered at him and accused him of planting the rumors, of orchestrating chaos. Elias did not deny or defend himself. Instead, he looked at the assembly and spoke softly, saying, "If they feared the predator, then let him face it again." At once, the chamber erupted in outrage. Some laughed, thinking it madness. Others whispered that it might be their only chance to end the terror. Sarika felt her heart's pound as she watched the human standing so small in the grand hall, yet sounding as if the world itself bent to his will. Voris slammed his claws and shouted that the human would perish, that this was suicide. But Sarika rose from her place and demanded they allow it. She argued that science demanded proof, and that if Elias succeeded, they could no longer call humanity weak. The chamber fell into argument, but at last the decision was made. The human would be released under watch and permitted to hunt the predator that had destroyed the convoy. Sarika followed the group as they transported Elias to the edge of the valley. Soldiers whispered behind, their helmets saying they were about to watch a fool die. The citizens gathered at a safe distance, curious and fearful, while Sarika kept her eyes on Elias. Every step he took down the slope was deliberate, his hands unbound, his eyes scanning the land with patience. The predator's roar came first, echoing like thunder across the rocks. The great beast emerged, its hide glistening with the blood of the convoy. It towered over Elias, each step shaking the ground. Sarika's throat tightened, for no weapon lay in his hands, only a broken spear shaft scavenged from the wreckage. But Elias did not run. He moved forward, steady and unshaken. The Draxor lunged with jaws wide, and Elias rolled beneath the crushing strike, rising with a shard of metal that he drove into the beast's underbelly. The roar that followed rattled the air, and dust shook loose from the cliffs above. The crowd gasped. Some cried out, expecting him to be torn apart. But Elias clung like a shadow, moving with impossible speed. He slashed and dodged and climbed upon the monster's back, using its own scales as handholds. The predator bucked and twisted, but the human held firm, his muscles straining his face. Set in grim focus at last, with a final thrust of sharpened steel, he drove the shard into the beast's eye, and the Draxor collapsed with a quake of earth silence, followed only broken by the heavy breathing of Elias as he stood over the fallen giant, blood staining his arms. Once again he bent down and tore a strip of flesh from the predator's side, raising it to his mouth and chewing slowly, as though mocking the terror of the watching crowd. Sarika's heart pounded in awe. She realized the galaxy had just witnessed something it could never unsee. The human was no myth, no exaggeration. He was truth, raw and undeniable, and from this day forward, humanity would be feared and remembered. The death of the great predator in front of the gathered citizens spread like fire through the entire planet. Ships leaving Jaren carried the tale to distant colonies, and traders whispered it in every market hall across the stars. The story grew larger with every retelling. Some claimed the human killed the beast with nothing but his fists. Others swore he ate the heart while it was still warm. Though Sarika knew the truth was enough to shake worlds, Elias Ward had faced the nightmare of Jaren and triumphed with nothing but his will and his hands. Already the people were beginning to change. Soldiers who once laughed at humans now studied his movements with careful eyes. Merchants who once called humans frail now wondered if they might be allies worth paying for protection. And even children played in the streets pretending to be the human who ate monsters. Sarika walked the city and felt the shift. It was not joy or celebration, but a deep, quiet fear that wrapped itself around every conversation, as if the galaxy had suddenly realized it was sharing space with a species that did not fit the rules of survival. The council could not agree on how to proceed. Voris argued furiously that the human was a danger, that he must be exiled or executed before his presence destroyed their authority. Others whispered that he was proof of a potential ally strong enough to face the predators of many worlds. Sarika was summoned again, this time not as a witness, but as an advisor, for she had studied Elias longer than any other. When asked what she believed, she spoke carefully. She told them that humanity was not an accident, that their world had shaped them among predators more savage than Jaren, that they had not merely survived, but learned to thrive by making every terror into prey. The chamber fell into silence, for no one wanted to admit the thought, yet no one could deny it either. When Elias was brought into the chamber again, his chains removed. This time he stood not as a prisoner, but as something more. His eyes calm, his posture unbent. Voris demanded he explain what humanity truly was and why they had been sent into the wider galaxy. Elias only shrugged and said humanity had always walked the line between prey and predator, and in time they had decided they would rather be hunters than hunted. Sarika saw the shift in the faces of the counselors. Respect was replacing scorn, though it was mixed with dread. The people outside gathered in thousands, chanting for another display of the human's strength, though some begged for his removal, fearing what he represented. Sarika herself felt torn, for though part of her admired his resilience, another part recoiled from the calm way he consumed the flesh of monsters, as though the act was as natural as breathing. The soldiers, however, no longer mocked him. Some began to approach, asking for training, guidance, secrets of endurance. Elias answered them without arrogance, showing them techniques of movement, breathing, and patience that made their strikes sharper, their defenses stronger. Sarika observed closely and realized he was reshaping them not by force but by example. Fear was turning into respect, respect into admiration, and admiration into quiet allegiance. Rumors spread even further of entire clans requesting humans as advisors of fleets, considering human officers for dangerous routes, and of planets that once ignored humanity, now seeking them as allies. Sarika sat in her quarters, staring out at the plains where the predators still roamed, and thought of the fragile figure who had shifted the weight of the galaxy by refusing to bow to terror. She knew the council would try to control the narrative, but she also knew they were already too late. The galaxy had seen the truth with its own eyes, and the name of humanity was no longer one of weakness, but of something fierce and unyielding. The council chambers were restless as the weeks passed, because the legend of Elias Ward had not faded but grown, until entire fleets were whispering of the human who ate predators, and the rulers of other worlds began to send envoys demanding proof. Voris knew he could no longer bury the truth, and so he proposed a challenge that would settle the matter once and for all. He declared that the human would be placed in the great arena, an ancient ground used to test warriors before the galaxy itself in contests of life and death. Not with one beast, but with many, the greatest predators gathered from across several systems released together in one trial. The counselors argued that it was cruel, that it was madness. Yet Voris smiled as he promised that the demonstration would either end the human myth forever, or crown humanity as something far more dangerous. Sarika listened with dread in her heart, because she knew what was coming, and when the decree was made, she hurried to Elias, who was held in a guarded chamber. He sat calmly sharpening a jagged piece of metal as though it were the most ordinary task. She told him of the challenge, her voice breaking with fear. But he only nodded and said that humans had always been tested by fire, and that this would be no different. Sarika could not stay silent. She asked him why he did not fear, why he could face creatures that froze the blood of every species she knew. He looked at her then and said that fear was always there, but fear was fuel, and that on Earth, those who let fear control them died, while those who bent it survived. His words chilled her because they were simple yet undeniable. The day of the trial arrived, and the great arena filled with thousands of witnesses from dozens of worlds. They sat in tiers of stone and steel watching as the gates opened and Elias Ward stepped into the vast expanse, his frame small against the towering walls. No weapons were given, only the environment itself and whatever he could make of it. Sarika sat among the observers, her heart's pounding as the gates on the far side opened with grinding thunder and the predators entered. First came the scaled rock beasts with claws like scythes, then the horned gorets known for ramming war vehicles aside, then the slithering serpents of Varos whose venom could paralyze a giant within moments. The crowd roared as the creatures filled the ground, their eyes fixed upon the lone human. Elias did not charge and he did not retreat. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his eyes studying each movement as though he were reading a script. The first rock beast lunged and Elias sidestepped, letting its claws dig into the sand. Then he climbed onto its back with a leap and drove his sharpened shard into the soft gap at its neck, twisting until the monster collapsed. The crowd gasped, but Elias did not pause. He moved swiftly, using the dead beast as a shield against the charging Gorat whose horns embedded in the carcass. Before Elias darted under its chest and drove his weapon upward, the serpent came next, its coils whipping across the ground. But Elias tore a fang from the dead rock beast and drove it into the serpent's eye. Using nothing but grit and timing, the arena echoed with roars, shrieks, and gasps. Sarika clutched the railing as she watched him drenched in blood and sand, yet moving with a rhythm that felt less like battle and more like a dance. When the final predator fell, the arena was silent for a breathless moment before it erupted into chaos. Some shouted in horror, others cheered in awe. Voris tried to rise and shout that the human was unnatural, that he was cursed, but his voice was drowned by the roar of thousands. Elias stood in the center of the carnage, lifting a piece of predator flesh to his mouth and chewing slowly, his gaze sweeping the crowd with calm defiance. Sarika felt her chest tighten because she knew this was no longer just a display of survival. It was a declaration humanity had revealed itself as the apex predator of predators, and the galaxy had no choice but to believe. The arena fell into an uneasy silence as the last echoes of cheers and horror faded into the heat of the midday sun. Sarika ran through the corridors beneath the stands, searching for Elias, and when she finally found him, he was sitting calmly among the remnants of the battle, his hands covered in the blood of the apex predators. Yet his expression was serene, as though he had only been walking through a garden. She ran to him and threw her arms around him, asking if he was alive, and he only laughed softly, saying that humans survived because they never gave up and never let fear dictate their actions. Sarika looked around at the ruined arena. The massive bodies of creatures that had terrorized entire worlds now lay defeated, and she realized that this display would forever change how humanity was seen across the stars. Word spread faster than any fleet could travel across every system. Every council and every world that had doubted humans now trembled with awe and fear. Voris was forced to descend from his throne, unable to deny what he had witnessed. He met Elias's eyes, and for the first time felt something like respect, mixed with the sharp sting of humiliation. He attempted to warn the councils that humans were reckless, but no one dared contradict what the entire galaxy had seen, and the envoys that had arrived with demands now bowed their heads in submission and offered treaties, pledges, and alliances. They offered what humans had never demanded. Yet it was clear that no one would forget the warning that a human had eaten predators that other worlds had sworn were unbeatable. Sarika walked beside Elias as they left the arena. The sun burned red on the horizon, and she realized that the man she had thought fragile was now a symbol of humanity's unbreakable spirit across the corridors. The cleaners and soldiers whispered stories of how a single human had survived, what even fleets of warriors could not, and these whispers grew into legends that would be carried across generations. The galaxy was no longer a place where humans were underestimated. They were feared, they were respected, and most importantly, they were seen as something different, something dangerous and unstoppable. Elias did not celebrate, or boast instead. He looked toward the stars and said that the challenge was only a beginning, that the galaxy was full of predators and threats, and that humans would meet each with the same courage and cunning he had shown in the arena. Sarika smiled and felt pride and fear tangled in her chest, because she knew that every being that had ever looked down upon humans would now reconsider every judgment and every plan against them. She knew wars would change, treaties would bend, and that the stories of this day would be retold in countless ways. Yet none would capture the full truth that humanity did not rely on weapons alone, but on instinct, intelligence, endurance, and the unyielding refusal to surrender when they were pushed to the edge. As the days passed, the records of the trial were transmitted to every corner of the galaxy, and humans on other worlds received the transmissions with disbelief. Some laughed, some cried, and some simply stared at the screen, not daring to challenge what they had seen. Elias and Sarika returned to Earth not as ordinary humans, but as legends, and as ambassadors of a race that had finally claimed its rightful place in the hierarchy of life. The predators that had once hunted humans now became a symbol of victory over fear and weakness, and every young human born after this day would hear the tale of Elias Ward, who faced the apex of alien predators and emerged victorious, and they would grow, knowing that survival was not merely living but dominating when necessary. They would know that the galaxy itself could be tested and bent by human ingenuity and determination. Sarika looked at Elias one last time before they left the grand arena, and she whispered that the world would never be the same, and he only nodded, saying that it should not be the same, that humans were not meant to be hidden, not meant to be small or weak, but meant to rise above all challenges. The legends of the battle became immortalized in songs, in holographic records, and in the eyes of every being that had witnessed humanity's triumph. And though some still feared humans, the fear was tempered with respect and awe, for they had seen what humans could do when pushed to the absolute limit. And in the quiet moments under the stars, Elias Ward smiled, knowing that the true victory was not just in surviving the apex predators, but in showing the galaxy that humanity had arrived as an unstoppable force, and that they would not just survive, but thrive and conquer every trial the universe could throw at them. And as he looked toward the horizon where distant suns glimmered, he knew that this was only the beginning, for humans would rise higher and fiercer than any had ever imagined, and the galaxy would never forget the day humanity feasted on the apex predator and proved that fear itself belonged to them now. The galaxy had grown quiet in the aftermath of the battle, yet it was a silence charged with awe and tension. Every council, every fleet, and every species that had ever looked down on humanity now whispered in hushed tones about the human who had faced the apex predator and lived. They could not unsee the strength and cunning that had shattered centuries of assumptions. Elias and Sarika moved through the remnants of the arena side by side, their steps steady, their minds sharp. Every eye that turned toward them carried wonder or fear, yet neither human flinched. They had faced impossible odds and emerged, not broken, but stronger. The horizon glowed with twin suns casting long shadows across the broken ground, and Sarika felt a weight lift from her chest. She had watched worlds tremble and species falter, yet humanity had endured, and now she understood that the story of survival was only part of the truth. The real story was how humans had thrived when all else seemed lost, how they had turned fear into strategy and desperation into triumph. Elias paused on a ridge and looked across the scarred plains where the predators had once ruled. He traced the outlines of their massive forms still smoldering from the final encounter, and in his gaze there was no triumphal arrogance, only calm observation. He understood that the apex predator had been a challenge not just of strength but of perception, and the universe had revealed itself in flashes of danger and instinct that only those who refused to yield could understand. Sarika watched him and felt a swell of pride for every human who had doubted themselves or their kind would now carry the legend of what had been achieved. The whispers would grow into stories and stories into myths and myths, into the eternal reminder that humans were not to be underestimated. The envoy. Ships began to arrive cautiously. At first, their engines low hums of respect and curiosity. They had seen the records of the battle, and now approached not with threats, but with propositions. Treaties, offers of peace and recognition they had witnessed. A species rise beyond the confines of expectation, and the galaxy could not ignore it any longer. Elias stepped forward to meet the leaders of worlds who had once mocked and dismissed humans, his voice calm, steady, and clear as. He spoke. He conveyed not arrogance but assurance that humanity would not simply exist. They would assert themselves. They would explore, conquer, and defend with the same unyielding resolve that had carried them through the arena. The leaders listened, and for the first time felt the weight of genuine understanding that humans were a force shaped by adversity and sharpened by challenge. They understood that the apex predator was not the final test, that the universe would continue to offer dangers and enigmas, yet humans had proven they could face the unimaginable and emerge unbroken. Children on distant planets would hear of Elias and of Sarika, and of the day humans feasted on what had been considered invincible, and they would grow not in fear but in courage and ingenuity, and in the knowledge that no matter how terrifying the predator, no matter how insurmountable the challenge, humans would rise above it. The horizon burned red and gold as the suns dipped low, and for a fleeting moment the universe seemed to pause as if acknowledging the shift in its order. Sarika placed her hand on Elias's shoulder and smiled. Knowing that every being who had witnessed this would carry the truth with them forever, humans were no longer underestimated. They were revered, they were respected, and they were feared, and that recognition would ripple across the galaxy in echoes that no force could silence. As the first stars of night appeared, Elias looked up and whispered that the journey was only beginning, that the universe was vast, full of predators unseen and challenges unknown. Yet he felt no fear, for humanity had shown that when driven by necessity, guided by intellect, and fueled by indomitable will, there was no apex they could not face, no frontier they could not cross, and no destiny they could not claim. The stories of this day would be told for generations, and the legend of humanity's triumph over the apex predator would inspire awe, hope, and respect wherever sentience existed. And as night fell, the arena stood quiet, no longer a place of terror but a monument to human strength and resolve. And in the hearts of those who had survived and witnessed the impossible, a new chapter of history began, written not in ink or stone but in courage, triumph, and the enduring spirit of humanity. The end.